British history. So with that, I give it to Larry.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, welcome to everybody. We don't have as many people as you had for the inkpot test, but we're still okay. That was a great start yesterday. Let's hope we can continue. Well, one of the smaller ones. Not that one, but a different one. That'll help you. We did invest in a little light here, but we didn't bring it, so. Welcome, everyone. I'll introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. Many of you do. Larry Schofer. I have a PhD in history from long ago, although I taught at the University of Pennsylvania for a while. I had a number of other careers. But now that I'm in Village College, I've been released from those constraints, and I've been happy to do a number of courses on European history, which is what I was studied and what I'm interested in. This is a course that I've called Social Crises in British History. If you look at American television or American advertising, it seems to be a fascination with the British royal family. It just keeps going. Not just Elizabeth II and now Charles III, but we have Henry VIII is all over TV, Henry VIII and his wives. I will say something about kings and queens, but that's not the focus of what I want to do. So the other thing that got me when I was an undergraduate, that all these modern history courses would end around the First World War. And I have always determined that I'm going to go further than that. So let's just take a look at Brexit for a minute, even though it's not the beginning of the course. Brexit, was the vote where Britain withdrew from the European Union. They had a referendum in 2016, and they withdrew by 2020. Remember, Boris Johnson was the prime minister. Exit means exit. And if you look at that vote, that map, it suggests who voted to leave. The yellow voted to leave. And you see it's north is Scotland that voted to stay. And in the south around London voted to stay. What's interesting about the map is that when we look at the Civil War of the 17th century, there are some similarities to that map. But we'll see that. But why did they leave? It's a question. There was a certain amount of resentment against the European Union. What happens is Brussels, which is the administrative center of the European Union, puts out all kinds of rules and regulations. And the British kept feeling we are different. We don't want those to overrule what we think are sacrosanct British rules. And then you have the issue of immigration. We know that in the United States, it's all over Europe, the same issue of immigration. And in Britain, they were blaming the European Union for allowing in the Afghans, the Syrians, the Africans, people from all over the world. And there's this, again, sounds like the United States. There's an anti-establishment populism. They distrust the elite, those financiers from London, those people who are running the government. And one survey suggests that manual labor voted 71% to leave. And then there's a British tradition of what they used to call splendid isolation. It's like the old joke about storm in the channel, continent isolated. So this is just an example of a demonstrator I thought was particularly graphic, believe in Britain. Well, let's go back in time. How did we get to Brexit in the 21st century? And I want to go back to the Tudor dynasty, which is the end of the 15th century. Henry VIII is in the 16th century, was the first British king to try to make the monarchy dominant over society in a way that it hadn't been before. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. But here is a famous portrait of Henry VIII. And after Henry VIII, we will talk about the Civil War of the 1640s, which really changed lots of things in England, and the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, which kicked out the King, James II, and brought in a different dynasty. And more important, Parliament becomes the crucial lawmaking body. That's what all of this is about over 2 centuries. What's the role of the king and what's the role of Parliament?
Larry, excuse me, we're not seeing your PowerPoint.
That's a problem. Let me go back and see what we can do about that. We're going to close the PowerPoint.
You're not, you never tried screen sharing.
Yeah, I'm going back and we're going to go into this now. And I have to have the file open to see it. Hang on. Share screen. That did not come up.
I don't see
why.
I don't see your slides.
No, I know that. I'm trying to figure out why.
You have to hit share screen now.
No. Larry, drop that down. Yeah,
It's not showing on there. So we're going to do that. Just a minute. We'll do this. All right. Now that should give us. I'm not having luck with this. We are seeing lots of people. Now we're going to try to get our share screen to come up.
Drop it down, you minimize it, so it's down at the bottom of the screen.
Oops, just the opposite.
Yeah, just there. Yeah, it should be. Now try share screen again. There you go.
There you go. All right.
Okay, it started screen.
It takes a village to work a computer.
Yeah, but
All right, Paul, can you see it now?
I can
Start.
see a
Very good.
screen. I'm not
Start
sure it's the one you want. It looks like it has one big picture on the right and a column of.
Yeah, I'm
of-
gonna, we'll take
other
care of that in a
items on the
second.
left.
Yeah, we're gonna do something about that. You have to move this control panel. We're gonna go slideshow.
There it is. No, you were there.
Here's, it's okay, but we have those slides again.
That looks right. That looks right.
Can you see them now, Martha?
Yes, it looks the way it's supposed to now.
That was
Okay.
perfect.
Perfect. Well, it's never anything perfect with computers. I consider us still in the Model T age where we have to go around with a car with a chest full of tools to try to fix it as we go along. Okay. We have Henry VIII. And I just mentioned there's William III, who is the Dutch noble who comes in and becomes King of England in 1688. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that revolution, but it did occur. Well, in 1688, Parliament takes over. In 2016, at the time of the Brexit referendum, is the first time Parliament has been overruled since 1688. I mean, they don't talk about it, but in the name of opposing foreign control over Great Britain, parliamentary sovereignty is questioned. It's revolutionary in a way. Now, of course, you have this tradition. You know, Scotland had its referendum, and the Scots decided not to vote to leave Great Britain, but the referendum is now instituted in a way in British politics. And, you know, leave means leave. That's what happened when they left in 2020. Well, going back, who are the Tudors? That's the beginning of the course. That's this family, starting with Henry VII, who some of you may have heard of the Wars of the Roses. That's this actually I don't call it clans in Britain, but that's what they were in the 15th century. And in 1485, Henry VII becomes the King of England, and he's followed by Henry VIII, who is, we'll say more about him. Edward VI is a child. He doesn't live very long. Mary is the woman known as Bloody Mary because of her executions of Protestants. And then Elizabeth, who's famous, 1558 to 1603. She dies without children. Well, what's our image of Henry VIII? You know, he's been on television, he's been in books. Here he is, that's a famous portrait again. Let's see if we can move this out of the way and see him. He needs a little Weight Watchers. Marriages and court intrigue, that's what we hear about. And there are all his wives. It's a beautiful picture, but Catherine of Aragon is the one where he has this, if you recall, he insists on a divorce. And this is what precipitates the break with the Roman Catholic Church. He wants a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Anne Boleyn, beheaded, and she's on television, and we'll mention that. I just want to mention Anne of Cleves, who they say she was lucky she was ugly, in that there are no photographs at the time, of course. So when it was proposed to Henry VIII that he marry her, he got a portrait, and the portrait made her look glamorous. And when she came to England, he couldn't stand her and eventually got sent back to Germany, probably saved her from beheading like some of the other wives. But let's see what we can do here. What was behind his power? That's, you know, what makes a king? Why do people obey the king? Why do people in our country, you know, obey the president? I mean, there's a question of force behind the king, and that's what I want to talk about. Who controls the force in society? And that takes us into the notion of what is feudalism. It's a term that floats around a lot. And here is an image of an act of homage, where in feudalism, a noble or someone, or landowner, swears fealty to his overlord. And this goes up the scale all the way up to the king. But the notion of what feudalism is, historians like to debate these issues. But remember that there are private armies. So if you swear fealty to your lord, you also swear you're going to bring your warriors with you if there's an issue. And that's, if you look at, say, the Wars of the Roses, that's what it's about. the leaders get their armies and they establish alliances with other nobles who bring their men with them. And this goes on all through the 16th century too. It's a struggle to create a central government. So here's a notion of a feudal system without going into detail, but you see it goes, the king on the right, the king is granting land to the barons, and the barons are granting land to the knights, and the knights, well, generally peasants are not included in the feudal system, but we'll include them here. On the left side, the peasants are supporting the knights with food and service. The knights give military service to the barons, and the barons bring their knights to support the king. So this is a simplified notion of how the feudal system works. And it did work for a long time because there was no clear central government. One of the things that people would say that who's the strongest person in the feudal system, it's the baron who can protect his castle. Well, that's what Henry VIII would like to change. In the Wars of the Roses, that's what that situation I was just describing. And the point is, who controls violence in society? You know, today, it's the police force, if you think about it, in our society. They're not always successful, but they have the right to control violence. And then the Tudors, what they wanted to do all over the 16th century is to assert the royal monopoly of violence. You no longer settle, if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you no longer can call out your gang of tough guys and take over. You have to turn to the monarchy to support you. And that is both in public and private things. And that's really a revolution. You know, we're used to it, but this is when it happens in England, and it takes a long time, probably more than a century to get there. So after the Wars of the Roses, and these are just some images of those wars, I just thought they were cute images. And you notice it's the guys on horseback who are they're the knights, and they're supported by all the warriors. The Tudor approach was to reduce the size of retainers. So in the feudal system, your people who support you are your retainers. So what the king would like to do is reduce the number of people that you have so that they're not so powerful. And one of the things they do is try to change castles into palaces. I mean, there's a real difference. Like here is the image of a castle, and you know, how do you get in? It's up on a hill, sometimes surrounded by a moat with bridges, drawbridges that close at night. And what they want a king would like you to have is move to upstairs, downstairs. So, you know, this really, if you think of that's the tradition of that huge elite place, and that private quarrels are not to be settled by force of arms. And what they're trying to do is change the attitude of the nobility, that resorting to violence, which is what they were used to doing, is now to be dishonorable, morally wrong. And again, it's not so easy to change people's opinions about that. You know, they get riled up, and you have a number of revolts against royal power. And that change took at least 100 years. Well, let's take Henry VIII, who's the Henry VIII and Elizabeth are the two most famous of the Tudor rulers. In 1523, I think it was, he wrote a pamphlet attacking the Protestants. And he gets the title of Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. And if you look at British coinage, even today, you see FIDDEF, it's right on there. They've retained that title. The irony is 7 years later, he breaks with the church, but that's conveyed by the Catholic Church. And here is an image from the 17th century. The most high and mighty Prince Henry VIII, by the grace of God, King of England, France, and Ireland. And we'll spend the whole class on Ireland later on. But Henry VIII had a chief hatchet man, Thomas Cromwell, don't confuse him with Oliver Cromwell of the 17th century, whom we'll talk about next week. Thomas Cromwell is the guy who makes things happen, the chief of staff. And he proposes to Henry VIII that they dissolve the monasteries. Now, why would you do that? He's already broken with the Catholic Church. And these are images. Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Cranmer, who is the leading ecclesiastic for what becomes the Anglican Church, and Henry VIII. But there were, we think, this is one count, in England, 260 monasteries, 300 clergy houses, 142 nunneries, 183 friaries, 12,000 people. And all of England only has 500,000 at the time. And what I don't have here is the percentage of the land that they own, but it was a very large percentage of land is owned by these various church institutions, which we put all together as monasteries, but it means all these institutions. And here is an image of of an abbey dissolved in 1539, just to give you some idea of the magnificence. These are big places, these abbeys, some of them. Well, those reforms, and we'll say some more about them in a second. There are problems for Henry. First of all, he executes his second wife, Anne Boleyn. It isn't clear why. Mainly, he wants a son, and she didn't give him a son. And we have people upset over the monasteries. Here is a gruesome image of Anne Boleyn being beheaded. The Catholic majority in England we think saw her execution as a judgment on heretics, since Anne Boleyn is a heretic, and Henry VIII is also considered a heretic. And you do get protests. It's not as though Henry got divorced in the early 1530s, and then everyone switched over to what we call the Church of England. There was one big demonstration, something called the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, which was a spontaneous mass protest by conservative elements in Northern Ireland. Remember the map, we saw Northern Ireland, they voted to leave Brexit. It's a Catholic area at the time. It's in this sense, hesitant about the monarchy. Here's an image of the Pilgrimage of Grace being led by some people considered religious leaders, and then it's a popular movement. If you could see the picture closely, what weapons are they carrying? You have soldiers in the front, but then we have people behind with pitchforks and with other kind of farm implements. And what they demanded was dismiss Thomas Cromwell, dismiss Archbishop Cranmer, restore the monasteries, legitimize the daughter Mary. The first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had a daughter, Mary, who later becomes Queen of England, Bloody Mary. And they call on the king to prosecute the heretics. And they had maybe 40,000 people marching. It's a pretty big demonstration. And in a sense, it's the first act in the English wars of religion. Catholic North versus the West and Southeast. And that goes on until 1688, on and off. And we'll see next week the bloody civil wars of the 1640s has the same geographic distinction. I'm not sure what that is. Let's get rid of it. Well, those pilgrims in the Pilgrimage of Grace are appeased, and once they're appeased, calm down, then Thomas Cromwell starts cracking down. And here's, this is the Lincolnshire Rising in Lincolnshire in the north. Began in this church in October 1536. This is Pilgrimage of Grace. The vicar was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn in 1537. Drawn and quartered is a pretty gruesome affair. I don't need to give you the details. You can look that up, but it's pretty ugly. And the king is increasingly conservative. I don't know why that little picture is there. I don't like it, but
You hit the carrot in the middle of the top of the green thing. Yeah, that's it.
okay.
Larry, while you're hit the chat and close it. It decides the bar.
It says can't see the pictures. All right, let's move that bar so we can see the bottom.
That should go to
It'll go away until I touch it again. So what happened under the Tudors? It's this assertion of royal monopoly over violence. Remember, that's what I was mentioning before. Who controls violence, public and private? And the whole trend of the monarchy under Henry and later is to have the government control violence. It's not so easy. They don't have a police force and they don't have an army. So they have to rely on some of those feudal lords. So what they're trying to do is have some agents of violence control other agents of violence until they can have some kind of centralized authority. Here's an example, though, about the monasteries. How did they get at them? There's a lot of corruption. And the one example is this abbot of Peterborough Abbey, where the abbot has a mistress and he's selling stuff off at a profit. Here's Peterborough, current Peterborough Cathedral, but this is where the abbey was. So the abbey is dissolved, the cathedral is still there. So this is the kind of, and actually Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, is buried there. She's there. If you go to Peterborough in England, you can see this. This saying, acknowledgement that she was a legitimate Queen of England, Catholic. The other thing I want to mention is this book, which gets a hell of a lot of publicity, gets TV, and I assume some of you have read this book, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And essentially, it presents Thomas Cromwell as a kind of well-meaning power broker who sort of charmed or was friendly to Anne Boleyn before she was decapitated. But it's a nice book that I recommend it for reading, not for history, but as a novel. So here we have a comment by Simon Schama. I don't know if you know Simon Schama. Simon Schama did a long series of television programs on history of England, and I'll mention the name of his book later. He says, when I was doing research for a history of Britain, and that history of Britain, it's about 1,000 pages, but she says it's not a history, it's his personal ideas. The documents shouted to high heaven that Thomas Cromwell was, in fact, a detestably self-serving, bullying monster who perfected state terror in England, cooked the evidence, and extracted confessions by torture. So Hilary what he's saying is Hilary Mantel is romanticizing this very evil guy. And he's not expressing any opinion about Hilary Mantel's novel, just saying his opinion is about Thomas Cromwell. And I threw this in because I'm assuming a number of you have read that book. Or there's a TV show too, isn't there? I think, yeah. Well, here are some images of what happens when they dissolve the monasteries. Here, down here on the bottom, you have this guy bringing a writ saying you're out, and the friars and the monks are leaving. And over here on the right, these treasures being carted away. I mean, Henry needed money. All central governments need money, and this is one of the way he got money. And what it does is remove a center of power. That is, the church was an important center of power, and now it is really the lay peers will become much more powerful. And we can ask what the role of monasteries in English life was. Well, remember, people were concerned about going to heaven. They were concerned about their souls. Confession for Catholics is still an important item. And remember, until Henry VIII, everyone who's involved in a church is a Roman Catholic. So the church has a lot of influence. And that's why it becomes difficult to break that influence, but it did happen. And then what we have, though, we got rid of the church. Now we have the feudal system, and Henry VII tried to limit the nobles. He was unsuccessful. And Henry VIII, well, Henry VII had no standing army. He had no paid local officials. So if you don't have a police force and you don't have local officials, how do you run the country? What you do is you outsource it to local nobles. And this goes on for centuries, gets smaller and smaller. But here you have, let's say the Duke of Northumberland, and he's got his retainers, and they're the ones that force the law. We may read about the sheriff of Nottingham Forest against Robin Hood, but the sheriff is not employed by the state. He's a local official. And so the king has to rely on these armed followers. And just an image here. Here's one image of soldiers, although I have my doubts that soldiers stood around reading a book. And just an image of fighters there. So how do you combat the nobles? You try to generate a militia. And it's not a centralized thing. You sort of get local people and find a way of paying them to participate, to support you. And the militia is the beginning of the centralization of a government. And here is, on the right, we have these guys here is engaging in sword fight. And in the left, we have the militia, which people dressed more plainly. They're not necessarily drawn from the upper ranks of society. Elizabeth kept trying militias too. Elizabeth rules from 1558 to 1603. So it's the second half of the 16th century. And you study English literature, there's this flowering of literature with her. Shakespeare's 1564 to 1616. So it's right in Elizabeth's reign. But she's not interested in the literature so much, but in controlling the locals, and she uses a militia on and off. Her cousin, Elizabeth's cousin, was Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been raised in France, and Mary, Queen of Scots, claimed that she was the legitimate Queen of England. And one of the people who supported her was a man named the Earl of Northumberland. Let's see. And here's northern England. You see the red line I've placed around the area of Northumberland. It's just south of Scotland, just to locate what we're talking about here. He's a very big deal, and he becomes one of her supporters. And what happened when Mary finally imprisoned Mary Queen, when Elizabeth imprisoned Mary Queen of Scots, she was trying to get at the gentry and to deprive the Earl of some of his offices, and they built up other gentry under an enemy of Northumberland. And as a result, the Earl of Northumberland revolted, and very few tenants came to help him. You know, the Duke of Norfolk was one of his guys, and they couldn't get these. The feudal system is breaking down in this sense. They're not honoring their promise to support their lord. And Earl of Northumberland is executed for treason. And then he's beatified by the Catholic Church as a Catholic hero. Here is an image of him, Thomas Percy, Earl of Northumberland, died in 1573. Elizabeth also ordered 700 rebels hanged, but her advisors sort of blocked that from happening. They didn't hang them, but that was her order. And this is just for all our literary friends. Banquo Seward, who's the Earl of Northumberland in Macbeth, is a friend of Macbeth, and he's murdered by assassins ordered by Macbeth. Just to put Northumberland in English society. I just threw that in. I thought that was a curious side note. But well into the late 16th century, it's still Elizabeth's reign, the greater nobles attracted the younger sons of gentry as household servants. It's a little weird, but that's how they got their training. And the gentry begin to resist this. They don't want to be butlers and whatever else the household servants do for the nobility. And you begin to get some idea of book learning in place of noble service. Again, it's a slow process, but it's something new. And the gentry begin to consider personal service as socially humiliating, which we would probably agree with that. You know, if you're high in society and you send your children off to be maids and butlers and cooks and so on. So in 1570s, you get the Earl of Oxford. This is an example. Earl of Oxford has his gentleman followers and 100 yeomen. I mean, this is a little private army, if you will. It's a little. But in the 16th century, our old friend, the Earl of Northumberland, has 171 people in his household. Northumberland family did not die out, even though the Earl was executed. But by the mid-17th century, the households have dropped to between a mere 30 and 50. So, you know, from our point of view, those are giant, but they're much smaller than they had been in an earlier age. And here is the successor, probably the grandson of the Earl, who was executed in 1573. So what kept the system going? I'm saying, you know, the king is trying to break it down. Well, the crown needed help. There are times when the French, they thought the French were going, they thought the French were going to invade. You have this famous destruction of the Spanish fleet in 1588, where they thought Spain was going to invade. So the crown needs the lords, it needs those private armies. The militias are not good enough yet to run the country. Sir Walter Raleigh he made a comment. There were many earls who could bring into the field 1,000 barbed horses, a barbed horse from North Africa. Many a baron who could bring 500 or 600 barbed horses. And remember, each horse means a rider, a nobleman, a fighter, whereas very few of them can furnish 20 to serve the king. That is, they had all these people, but they were declining in the numbers they could provide. Here's a barbed horse from North Africa, I think, yeah. And there's a reduction of private arsenals. And they hear all these kinds of things that the people have. They have a corselet. There's a picture of a corselet. It's often what we think of as body armor. A caliber is a light musket, and they had handguns, bows and arrows, pikes. A bill is a short cutting tool, pole axes, all kinds of things to hack and beat your opponent and to protect yourself. And this stuff declines in importance as the central government becomes more important. And as we saw earlier, there's a change in fortifications. You get these palaces in place of castles. So once again, here's a 14th century castle fortified for so-called elite living, as opposed to a Tudor mansion in the end of the 16th century. It's quite a difference. It's similar to those two pictures I showed earlier, but that's what's happening. So, I mean, one of the themes, I mean, this theme I keep hammering at, there's this decline in the system of decentralized violence. The violence becomes centralized now. If the king wants to do something, he can send his guys and beat you up or kill you or whatever. Just one example, there's a broadsword. If you look at it on the upper right, this is a kind of thing that you use in battle in an open field. You slash away at your opponent. But this is being replaced by the rapier, which is what you use in a duel between two people, not in a, you can't, if you were riding a horse and fighting an enemy, you wouldn't want to use a rapier just because you're going to stick someone directly, as opposed to the broadsword, which you could swing around and kill people. And there's also a period of peace until the Spanish Armada comes, and the habit of military service declines. And well into the 17th century, what the nobles now are looking for is money and cultivation of the arts or of artists under them. So now, again, you get this is what the government is aiming for, change in the concept of duty. We want to serve the government. Here's another example. Well, first of all, there's a growth in mitigation. Instead of duels, instead of fights between armies, you go to court. So, as someone calls this, the most popular indoor sport is having a lawsuit. As the guy William Earl of Salisbury had pending lawsuits. In 1621, he had 29 pending, 1634, 20, 1637, 13 lawsuits. I mean, for those who know Dickens, it's like Jarndyce v. Jarndyce. They just keep going forever. But it certainly is more peaceable in society to have people slugging it out in the courts rather than calling out their men with their broadswords. So here's a review as we come to the end, toward the end here, the changing role of the aristocracy. Until about 1570, the Tudors ruled like medieval kings. They needed those local armies. They gradually built up the militias, and the kings cooperated, and queens cooperated with the aristocracy. The aristocracy being the very highest level of nobles. Under Elizabeth, you start to depend on the gentry, which is one level down. And there's royal interference with what's going on. And she does that in part by discriminatory use of patronage. Whom do you give very revenue producing offices. And the gentry becomes more and more ambitious under her. Here's Elizabeth. It's a famous picture of Elizabeth. It doesn't mean that the aristocracy was displaced. They're still influential as late as the 18th century or even today. But instead of having armies, they're using their money to buy votes. That is, they don't use violence. Here's as someone said, the votes in 1640 by beef, bacon, and bag pudding, and by permitting as many voters as possible to be drunk. This is how you get your support. And here's an image from the, this is an image from the early 19th century, posting to the election. There are these guys, nobles riding along in in one case in a wagon, throwing out goodies to the potential voters. And when we talk about the 19th century, that's the whole issue of how do you increase the number of potential voters. Church of England under Elizabeth, we talked about the aristocracy. Church of England, it's not free reign for Protestants. You know, she wants to have the Church of England as the dominant church, opposed to what are called recusants, which are the Catholics. But under the 1559 Settlement Act, which is the core of what people call the Elizabethan Compromise, everybody must attend an Anglican church. Occasionally, you have to take communion. They're not worried about theology. They don't have any catechism, what you believe. Just behave yourself and go to church sometimes. Oops, I don't want to do that. Zoom sharing. Okay, that emphasis on theology. And this is an image of where the Catholics were in England as late as the 18th century. They are, well, just to help you, I give you some of the geography of these places that you may have heard of, but not sure where they are. Northumberland, so way up on the Scottish border. Yorkshire, in the center of the country, and Lancashire, also in the center of the country. They're the people who voted for Brexit. It's the same area. So there are certain continuities. Recusants are those who refuse to attend Church of England services, and they get persecuted under Elizabeth, fines, property confiscation, imprisonment. Actually, that law was suspended under Oliver Cromwell, who is, the great hero of the Protestants, but he is not a hero of the Church of England. He's a hero of other Protestant groups, Puritans in particular. Puritans are in the main Church of England, but not the same as the mainline ones. And this finally settles in 1701, and this is still the case. No Catholic may be on the throne of England. And there were restrictions on Catholics, 1828-29, emancipation, and there were some restrictions on Catholics until 1920. So it takes a long time for these things to work out. I don't know what those restrictions were until the 20th century, but some were there. So this Elizabethan era, there are restrictions on locally controlled violence. She also is in favor of some immigration, bringing in skilled people from Flanders. They opened the first stock exchange, and there's some industrial expansion, tin and iron, linen and lace, glass soap, salt. But, you know, little things like houses now have glazed windows. Your utensils are pewter instead of wood. Hopefully it'll be without lead, but it's not clear. Population grows, wages decline. So it's not necessarily a great time for the lower income people. And enclosure of common land, we'll talk about that again next week. That's a big deal where there was common land that helped people who have a few cows or a few cattle. But for flocks of sheep, this is great to enclose the land, the more commons, and there are decreased opportunities for many villagers. And what happens is that with the monasteries closed, relief is needed. Monasteries did provide a social service. So this poor law, 1601, the able-bodied poor, the impotent poor, and dependent children. The able-bodied poor, you know, you're expected to work, you gotta sign up for welfare, and responsibility is passed to the family, and vagabondage, meaning unemployed people traveling around. There's some savage penalties. Here's a case of some being whipped, so-called vagabonds, punishment of the whipping post for vagrants and sturdy beggars. You know, again, I think some of us may be familiar with images like this out of Charles Dickens, where they didn't have a whipping post, but this whole notion of the able-bodied poor is important for these laws. Just a few things about home life. How did people heat and eat? Well, originally firewood, and you would think, and charcoal, which is made from wood, so you would think that the forests would be depleted. But what happened, even though they're cutting back on forests, they brought in all kinds of stuff from Norway and the Baltic, which had surplus wood, where populations were less dense. So it wasn't that they were being depleted. It's just that coal is better for heating. You get a hotter fire. And here is a 17th century coal mining begins, and these are the places in the British Isles where coal mining takes place. We won't go into any detail on that, but you know, if you look at you know, this is Scotland up here, and coal mining in the Midlands. And because of that, the whole house changes. That is, before they were open plan, and now you have a central hearth, which can send heat into parts of the house. Well, that was before. Now you have individual rooms with fireplaces, because the coal can heat a room. And especially after the Great London Fire of 1666, most of the city burns down. This is a cartoon, in a way, of the Great Fire, but it was pretty bad, the fire of 1666, when London just goes. This is just a curiosity. Medieval cuisine is cooked over the low heat of wood, and it's replaced by boiled vegetables and baked meat over the hotter heat of coal. And Britain's reputation for food has never recovered from that. You know, here's much parody: beans on toast. Yeah. Well, that's close to what I want to say about the early Tudors. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, no children. She was succeeded by James I, who was as I recall, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, collateral line. He's James I of England, 6th of Scotland. Remember, Scotland is an independent country. And it creates a big problem for the monarchs in England. Anyway, James I ruled till 1625. Here's a heraldic badge which suggests the union of the two crowns. The English rose from the Wars of the Roses, red roses won, and the thistle, which stands for Scotland. His mother was Queen of Scots, and he's a Calvinist. So now you have another big issue. John Knox, who is the great, well-known Calvinist preacher in Scotland, and very influential in Scotland. So the dominant church in Scotland is the Presbyterian Church, as coming under the influence of John Knox. And James also talked about the divine right of kings. Kings can do whatever they want. They did not need a Supreme Court decision to say they're immune. They just did it. He also, and this is out of curiosity interest, he doth wondrously covet learned discourse. He commissioned the King James translation of the Bible. He was an educated person, but he wanted this divine right. The state, as he says, the state of the monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only gods, lieutenants upon the earth, and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself, they are called gods. So we will stop here and can try to, we have a few minutes if you would like to, if some people have comments or questions. Other than we should get a computer that works. But have any other? Well, all right. Well, thank you for coming.